Hello guys.
Because of my father's new wife, I had to choose between schooling and family because I was smarter than my half-brother. 2 years ago, my life felt like it was finally starting. After years of relentless hard work, I'd achieved what I thought was impossible, an acceptance letter from one of the most prestigious universities in the country. It wasn't just my dream, it was my mom's too. Before she passed, she set aside a tuition fund specifically for me, ensuring I'd have the chance to chase the goals we talked about endlessly. That acceptance letter wasn't just a milestone, it was a promise fulfilled. I was over the moon, eager to share the news with my family. When I told my dad, Robert, his initial reaction was everything I hoped for. He beamed with pride, but then his wife, Linda, stepped into the room. One glance from her, and the joy drained from his face. Linda had never been my biggest supporter, to put it mildly. Ever since she and her son, Mark, entered our lives, I'd always felt like an outsider. Mark was her pride and joy, even though he spent his days doing absolutely nothing. While I burned the midnight oil, he barely lifted a finger, content to live off the comfort my dad provided. When Linda heard about my university plans, she didn't even try to hide her disdain. Her first words weren't congratulations, they were complaints. According to her, it wasn't fair for me to go while Mark was stuck at community college. She had the audacity to suggest that I defer my enrollment, claiming my tuition fund would be better spent saving her floundering event planning business. I was stunned. My father, who had always talked about the importance of education, stood silently beside her, looking torn. And then he said the words that shattered me, maybe we should consider what's best for everyone. From that moment, I knew my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Linda's suggestion sat like a stone in the room, heavy and uncomfortable. She argued that my tuition fund should be used to support her struggling event planning business and give Mark, her son, a chance to catch up. The way she spoke made it clear she felt entitled to make decisions about a fund my mom had worked so hard to leave behind for me. My dad didn't immediately disagree, which stung more than I expected. He started to frame it as a family discussion, but it quickly became clear whose side he was on. He brought up local colleges, suggesting I could stay nearby and study while the rest of the fund was redirected. It was obvious that redirected meant funnel to Linda and Mark. I couldn't believe it. The father who had always preached the value of education now stood with Linda, prioritizing her convenience and Mark's comfort over my future. Dad softened his tone, probably thinking it would make his words easier to accept, but the core of his message was brutal. If I didn't go along with this plan, I'd have to move out. That night, I made the decision. If this was how little my dreams meant to them, I couldn't stay. I packed my bags with shaky hands, torn between anger and heartbreak. The house was full of memories of my mom, her warmth, her encouragement, but staying under that roof meant abandoning everything she had worked so hard to give me. The next morning, I stood at the door, gripping my suitcase tightly. I glanced back at my dad, hoping for some sign of regret or hesitation, but he remained silent, almost cold. I left without another word, stepping into a world that felt both terrifying and full of possibilities. The first few weeks after leaving were rough. I crashed on a friend's couch while I figured out my next steps. It felt surreal to be cut off from the only family I'd ever known, especially for something as absurd as prioritizing Linda's failing business or Mark's lack of ambition over my future. But as painful as it was, I knew I'd made the right decision. Thankfully, my mom had thought ahead. Her tuition fund wasn't just money, it was a safety net. A lawyer had helped her set it up so that no one, not even my father, could touch it. I contacted the lawyer to ensure everything was in place, and when he confirmed it was all mine, I felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in weeks, the future didn't seem so uncertain. University started soon after, and it was everything I'd dreamed of and more. The campus buzzed with energy, and I threw myself into my studies. It wasn't easy adjusting to a new life without my family's support, but every late-night study session, every small victory in class reminded me why I'd fought so hard to be here. Meanwhile, my father's attempts to reach out were sporadic at best. I'd get the occasional voicemail, short, polite, and carefully worded, as if he were testing the waters. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. Every message felt like a reminder of how easily he'd sided with Linda and Mark. I wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. Despite everything, I was thriving. I made friends who became like family, people who supported me without strings attached. I found part-time work to cover the little expenses my tuition fund didn't, and slowly but surely, I built a life that was entirely mine. But just as I was starting to feel at peace, a call from Linda shattered the calm. Linda's name flashing on my phone was the last thing I expected. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I picked up, her voice came through sharp and agitated, like she had been rehearsing this conversation. She wasted no time getting to her point, she wanted money. Her business had officially collapsed, and she blamed me for not contributing when I had the chance. It was absurd. She ranted about how selfish I'd been, choosing to prioritize myself instead of helping the family when they needed me. She even called it greedy that I had used the tuition fund for its intended purpose, my education. I was stunned. For years, Linda had barely tolerated me, always making it clear that I was an outsider in my own home. Now, after everything, she had the audacity to demand money as if I owed her something. I didn't bother hiding my disbelief. I told her point blank that the money wasn't hers to take, and it never had been. That's when her tone shifted. Linda, who had always been calculating, decided to lay her cards on the table. She admitted that my father's recent attempts to reconnect weren't about repairing our relationship, they were part of a plan to manipulate me into giving him money to appease her. Hearing it out loud was like a punch to the gut. I had hoped, somewhere deep down, that my dad reaching out meant he regretted what had happened. But it was all just another scheme to prioritize Linda's needs over mine. I hung up without saying another word. My heart was pounding, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry, not out of sadness, but out of sheer frustration. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. I knew then that the distance I'd created wasn't just necessary, it was vital. After Linda's call, I knew it was only a matter of time before my father showed up. True to form, he arrived unannounced a week later. I found him waiting on the steps outside my apartment, looking disheveled and desperate. It was a far cry from the composed and proud man I remembered. He wasted no time pleading his case. Linda had left him, he said, and he was struggling to piece his life back together. He needed my support, financially and emotionally. He claimed he wanted to repair our relationship, that he regretted the choices he'd made and was ready to make amends. But I couldn't ignore what Linda had told me. Every word he spoke felt like it was laced with manipulation, a last-ditch effort to fix the mess he had helped create. I let him talk, watching as his excuses spilled out. He admitted he'd let Linda control him because he was terrified of being alone, that he'd put her and Mark first out of fear of losing his new family. When he finally stopped, I asked him one simple question: if Linda hadn't left, would you even be here? His silence was answer enough. The conversation shifted then. I told him exactly how his actions had affected me, how being forced to leave my home had made me question my worth, how every voicemail he left felt like a reminder that I wasn't enough for him to fight for. I laid it all out, every wound he and Linda had inflicted, and for once, he didn't try to defend himself. He begged for another chance, but I stood firm. Your choices have consequences, I told him. You chose to stand by Linda, and now you have to live with what that's cost you. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had the power in our relationship, not out of malice, but because I had finally taken control of my own story. I told him I needed time, maybe a lot of it, and that I wasn't ready to forgive. He left, shoulders slumped, looking like the weight of his decisions had finally caught up to him. After my father left, the overwhelming mix of emotions left me drained. For years, I had sought his approval, desperately wanting to believe that he'd see my worth without someone like Linda pulling his strings. But as the door closed behind him that day, a realization settled over me like a quiet storm: I didn't need his validation anymore. I wasn't the scared kid seeking a pat on the back or a rare "I'm proud of you." I had come this far without his support, and I could go further on my own. The days that followed felt lighter, as though shedding my connection to that toxicity had made room for something new. I threw myself into my studies and my work with a renewed sense of purpose. My friends, my chosen family, noticed the shift and celebrated every small step forward. They were there for late-night study marathons, offering words of encouragement when the workload seemed impossible. When I landed an internship in my dream field, they threw a small party for me, cheering me on like I'd won an Olympic medal. Yet, even in those moments of joy, doubt occasionally crept in. Late at night, when the world was quiet, I'd catch myself wondering, had I been too harsh with my dad? Could I have given him one more chance to prove he cared? But those thoughts were always short-lived. Memories of the years I spent being ignored, undermined, and dismissed would resurface, grounding me in my decision. I hadn't made these choices out of anger but out of self-preservation. Life outside of my family's shadow flourished. Graduation was just around the corner, and with it came a sense of accomplishment I couldn't have imagined 2 years prior. I'd turned my mother's dream for me into reality, and every challenge I'd faced along the way had only made me stronger. Meanwhile, through whispers from mutual acquaintances and the occasional social media post, I caught glimpses of the lives I had left behind. Linda's business had completely collapsed, weighed down by her poor decisions and refusal to adapt. Mark, unsurprisingly, had dropped out of community college and was back to living at home, doing little to change his trajectory. My father, now separated from Linda, had moved into a small, modest apartment. He looked older in the photos I stumbled upon, the kind of worn down that comes from regret and missed opportunities. Oddly enough, I didn't feel vindicated by their struggles. If anything, there was a deep sadness, a sense of loss for what might have been if my dad had chosen differently. I didn't wish them harm or struggle, but I had finally understood something crucial: their choices weren't mine to fix. I had carried the weight of their needs and expectations for so long that letting it go felt like learning to breathe again. As I walked through campus on my way to class one afternoon, I thought about my mom. She would have been proud, I was sure of it. Not just of the academic success or the future I was building, but of the fact that I had finally learned to stand up for myself. That thought carried me through the harder days, the moments when letting go of the past felt like trying to hold back a tide. I didn't need to look back anymore. My life was moving forward, and for the first time, it felt like it was truly mine. As graduation approached, life became a blur of final exams, job applications, and the thrill of planning the next chapter of my life. But then, out of nowhere, an unexpected letter arrived. It was from my father. The envelope was plain, with my name scrawled in his familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter, carefully written and unusually vulnerable. He congratulated me on my upcoming graduation, which he'd clearly learned about from social media or mutual connections. He expressed pride in my accomplishments, but the tone quickly shifted to something more somber. He admitted he'd made countless mistakes and asked if we could meet to talk. The letter wasn't long, but it carried the weight of years of unspoken words. He ended it with a line that stuck with me: "I don't deserve a second chance, but I hope you'll give me one anyway." For days, I wrestled with whether to respond. Part of me wanted to meet him, to hear what he had to say. But another part, stronger and louder, was wary. His past actions spoke volumes, and I didn't want to risk reopening old wounds for the sake of his guilt. In the end, I decided to wait. I had enough on my plate with graduation and the exciting opportunities ahead. I wasn't ready to give him an answer, not yet. The day of my graduation was a whirlwind of emotions. My friends, who had become my family, cheered me on as I walked across the stage. I felt a mix of pride and bittersweet joy, knowing my mom would have been beaming in the audience if she were still here. My dad wasn't there, and I hadn't expected him to be. This moment wasn't about him, it was about everything I'd achieved despite the odds. Later that evening, while celebrating with my friends, I found myself thinking about his letter again. Maybe I wasn't ready to forgive him, but part of me wondered if hearing him out would bring me the closure I didn't know I needed. For the first time in years, I realized I had the power to decide what role, if any, he would play in my life going forward. It wasn't just about him wanting a second chance, it was about whether I wanted to give one. After weeks of mulling it over, I decided to meet my father. It wasn't an easy decision, but something about the vulnerability in his letter made me feel like it was time. Closure, if nothing else, might help me finally lay the past to rest. I reached out to him with a simple message: "Let's talk." We met at a quiet cafe not far from my apartment. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting at a corner table, nervously fidgeting with his coffee cup. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slightly hunched, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there the last time we'd spoken. Seeing him like that stirred something in me, a mix of pity and frustration. He stood as I approached, offering an awkward smile. "Alex," he said softly, as if he weren't sure I'd stay. I nodded, sitting across from him. There was a long pause before he finally spoke. He started with an apology. It wasn't rushed or defensive, instead, he laid everything bare. He admitted that he'd failed me, that he'd allowed Linda to manipulate him and Mark's laziness to blind him to my efforts. He confessed that he'd always known I was the hardest working person in our family but that he'd been too afraid to disrupt the fragile balance he thought Linda maintained. As he talked, I listened, my emotions a storm beneath the surface. Hearing him acknowledge the ways he'd hurt me was validating, but it didn't erase the pain. He spoke about his regrets, about how losing Linda had forced him to confront the choices he'd made. He didn't try to excuse his actions, which surprised me. Instead, he said he wanted to do better, if I'd let him. When he finished, the table fell silent. I took a deep breath, weighing my words carefully. "I appreciate you saying all of this," I began. "But I need you to understand something. Your decisions hurt me deeply. They made me feel like I wasn't enough, like I had to fight for scraps of attention or respect." His face fell, but he nodded. "I know. I see that now. I wasn't ready to forgive him completely. Trust," I explained, "wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. But I told him I was willing to see where things might go, provided his actions matched his words." He looked relieved, even grateful, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of the father I'd hoped he could be. We left the cafe with no promises, just a tentative understanding that this was the start of something, whatever that might be. The days after meeting my dad were strange. On one hand, I felt lighter, like finally addressing our fractured relationship had lifted a weight I didn't even know I was carrying. On the other hand, I wasn't sure what came next. The walls I had built around myself weren't going to come down overnight, no matter how much he seemed to have changed. To his credit, he didn't push. Instead, he took small steps to rebuild trust. He started by sending me occasional texts, updates about his life, asking about mine, nothing too intrusive. They felt genuine, which was a relief. I wasn't ready for grand gestures or overt apologies on a daily basis, and he seemed to understand that. One weekend, he asked if I wanted to visit his new apartment. Part of me hesitated. I didn't want to step back into the kind of dynamic we had before, but curiosity got the better of me. When I arrived, I was surprised by how modest his place was. Gone were the trappings of the life he'd built with Linda. His living space was simple, almost Spartan, and it was clear he was living on a much tighter budget. "I know it's not much," he said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "But it's mine." I could tell he was trying, and for the first time in years, it felt like he was prioritizing something other than appearances. We talked for hours that day, about my graduation, my plans for the future, and even memories of my mom. For once, there was no tension, no underlying sense of competition or obligation. It was just two people trying to reconnect. Still, I kept my guard up. While he seemed genuine, years of hurt weren't going to disappear after a couple of conversations. I needed to see consistency, not just in his words but in his actions. Could he be the father I had always wanted him to be? Or was this just another phase of regret that would fade with time? As I left his apartment that day, he handed me a small box. "This was your mom's," he said. "I found it while packing up the house and thought you should have it." Inside was a collection of old photos and trinkets, little pieces of her life that I hadn't seen in years. I didn't cry, but the gesture hit me harder than I expected. Maybe he really was trying to make things right. Walking back to my car, I realized something important. Rebuilding our relationship didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant acknowledging it and moving forward, one cautious step at a time. In the weeks following our meeting, my father and I settled into a cautious rhythm. We kept our conversations light, slowly rebuilding a connection without diving too deep into the past. He respected my boundaries, and I appreciated that. For the first time in years, I felt like we were approaching something that resembled a genuine relationship, fragile, yes, but real. As for me, life was moving fast. I had graduated, landed a great job, and was getting ready to move to a new city for work. It was exhilarating, but also daunting. In the whirlwind of packing and preparing, my father reached out with an offer to help me with the move. Initially, I hesitated. Inviting him into my new life felt risky, like giving him a peek at the version of me that had flourished despite everything. But then I realized that part of healing meant allowing him to be there, not for the person he wanted me to be, but for the person I had become. The move went smoothly, thanks in part to my dad's help. He didn't overstep or try to insert himself too much. Instead, he quietly supported me, carrying boxes and sharing stories about the time he and my mom moved into their first place together. For the first time, I saw glimpses of the man he could have been all along, someone who cared, even if he didn't always show it in the right way. As we finished unpacking, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a modest check. The note read, "I know I can never repay you for the ways I've let you down, but I hope this can be a small step toward showing you that I'm serious about being in your life again, on your terms." I didn't need the money, but the gesture meant more than he could have known. It wasn't about finances. It was about effort, about him proving that he was willing to put in the work to make things right. In the months that followed, our relationship remained a work in progress. There were still moments of doubt, but they were outweighed by the small, consistent efforts he made to show that he was trying. And while I couldn't forget the past, I learned that I didn't have to let it define our future. Now, as I sit in my new apartment, surrounded by the life I've built, I feel a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. My dad and I aren't perfect, we never will be, but we're both trying, and that's enough. My story didn't end with the rejection I felt when I left home. It's still being written, one step at a time, with a focus on growth, forgiveness, and the life I'm creating for myself. And as for Linda and Mark, they're nothing more than footnotes now.
See you later.